From where I'm sitting on the wall to the right of me, I have three quotes that I always try to keep before my mind's eye. One is by Paul Brunton, the other one by Beethoven, and the third one by H.P. Blavatsky. So let's just spend just a few moments contemplating these words of our principal founder and direct our thoughts and love towards the suffering and loss entailed by the burning of our dear Theosophical Library and its priceless heritage in Altadena. But in a deeply inspiring talk for Leeds Lodge I heard just an hour ago, Professor Chad Mannion reminded us that we are the library of the world. We are the library of the world. And let us meditate on this, that we should never say things like, I don't know, therefore it's rubbish and false. You must study to know to understand, and understand to judge. Let's move on to the whole approach I'm going to adopt for this talk. We're going to have a conversation in Adyar between an inquirer and a Blavatsky over coffee. And we're going to ask her to situate and contextualize why she was chosen to come on the world stage, why at such a critical moment in the 19th century, and what was the paradigm shift, the worldview shift that she was tasked with changing. And she's asked that no questions just for now about her personal life. These can come later. So let's now join Blavatsky in conversation over coffee, and also that one thing that she always had between her fingers. Permettez-moi. What was the mission that we are celebrating? So we're going to inquire, why was the Theosophical Society founded? Well, for that, you better read the Mahachohan's letter, which is a summary by Mahatma K.H. of a conversation with the Mahachohan on the raison d'etre, why the Theosophical Society was founded. Now, the Mahachohan's letter was produced, she tells us, around 1881. And it's a summary by Mahatma K.H. of a conversation with the with the Mahachohan in reference to some arguments that Mr. Sinnett and Hume were posing about reforming the nature of the Theosophical Society. You know, they really thought they knew it all. Let's reform the Theosophical Society. But in a letter to Colonel Olcott, Mahatma K.H. referred to the Mahachohan as he to whose insight the future lies like an open page. And in a letter to Mohini Chatterjee, he said, one far greater than myself has kindly consented to survey the whole situation. Now, the Mahachohan had an active influence in the development of the TS. And he allowed then Mahatma K.H. to correspond with Hume and Sinnett, and later gave the consent for them to form the Anglo-Indian branch of the Theosophical Society solely under the express and unalterable condition that the new society should be founded as a branch of the Universal Brotherhood. a branch of the universal brotherhood. But why? Why? Because between degrading superstition and still more degrading brutal materialism, the white dove of truth has hardly room where to rest her weary, unwelcome foot. That was the situation around the time that the Theosophical Society was founded, where opinion in the world was divided between religious superstition and brutal materialism. So then that's a bit of a tall order. So let's ask, I don't know, should we perish the Theosophical Society with both its hapless founders? What's the task of Theosophists? Is it ethical or to develop occult powers? But then when I read the Mahachohan's letter, why then does he go on to mention Colonel Olcott? Well, rather perish the Theosophical Society with both its hapless founders, the Mahachohan tells us, then we should permit it to become no better than an academy of magic, a hall of occultism. That we, the devoted founders, the devoted followers of that spirit incarnate of absolute self-sacrifice and divine kindness, ever attainable on our poor earth, the man of men, Gautama Buddha, should ever allow the Theosophical Society to represent the embodiment of selfishness, the refuge of the few with no thought in them for the many, is a strange idea. Our task as Theosophists is intensely ethical. Not ours the goal to develop occult powers, nor gather more knowledge merely for the sake of knowledge, nor even to worship divinity to gain personal happiness. Ours is the task to discover the solutions, not of our ills, but of the ills of mankind as a collectivity, and to reveal the true philosophy, the true religion, the true light, which gives truth and nothing but the truth. You ask why then does the Mahachohan mention Colonel Olcott? Because that is the reason. Colonel Olcott works but to revive Buddhism, and he may be regarded as one who labors in the true path of theosophy, far more than any other man who chooses as his goal the gratification of his own ardent aspirations for occult knowledge. So, in answer to your question, the heavy emphasis is on brotherhood. Read the first object and you will see this. Brotherhood, not occultism. And only when that is universally established, brotherhood that is, then can the unexplained laws in nature and man's latent powers, as per the third object, be safely explored. But then if you emphasize brotherhood so much, why then this tremendous outpouring of occultism that you give us, for example, in the secret doctrine? You keep saying brotherhood comes first. Why all this occultism? Well, there's an answer, and it is this. It is really to counter the still more degrading, brutal scientific materialism that I just spoke about earlier, by showing men, especially the men of science, that nature is not just a fortuitous concurrence of atoms, and to situate man's position, man the microcosm, in the macrocosm, the universe. And it is also for that reason that we need to display or to promulgate some of the occult doctrines to rescue from degradation the archaic truths in order to uncover their unity, and especially to furnish the deficit in science regarding the ignorance of the occult side of nature. So the aim of this work, the Secret Doctrine, which I'm showing you now, is to show, as I said, that nature is not a fortuitous concurrence of atoms, and then, therefore, to assign to man his rightful place in the universe. And I need reminding you that the occult side of nature has never been approached by science of modern civilization. That's all very well. Sounds like a jolly good idea, but how can such laudable aims be accomplished in practice? There is a universal, tried and trusted way. Using the technique known in modern terms as consilience. Now, I don't use the word consilience in any of my writings, but this is a modern term, and it is really a scientific principle that evidence, even weak evidence, gathered from a large number of independent and unrelated sources can be brought together to agree on a strong conclusion. And consilience is therefore the linking together of principles from different disciplines, especially when forming a single comprehensive theory. So if I now just ask you to think about this, it is impossible to treat this whole subject of cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis, the coming together of cosmos and man, the various races of man, and all of that. It's impossible to treat of this subject as one would treat of ordinary evolution of an art or science in some well-known historical nation. So only by bringing together before you an abundance of proofs, all tending to show that in every age, under every condition of civilization and knowledge, the educated classes of every nation made themselves the more or less faithful echoes of one identical system and its fundamental traditions. Only by doing that can you see that the so many streams of the same water must have had a common source from which they started. Now, what was this source? What is this source? So if coming events are said to cast their shadows before us, and past events cannot fail to leave their impress, then it is by examining these shadows of the hoary past on the eternal screen of every religion and philosophy that we can, by checking them as we go along and comparing them, we can trace out the body that produced them. Because there must be truth and fact in that which every people of antiquity accepted and made the foundation of its religion and its faith. I would remind you of what Halliburton said. Here one side and you will be in the dark. Here, the other side, you'll also be in the dark. But here, both sides, and all will be clear. The public so far has access to and heard but one side, or rather, the two one-sided views of two diametrically opposed classes of men, the theologians and the scientists. So that is how I'm answering your question about how Blavatsky uses consilience by bringing together a large body of evidence from diverse cultures and sources to form a strong conclusion. But then our inquirer says you talk about evidence. And here it is. That's the evidence behind consilience. The abundance of proofs in every age and the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. But that again sounds all very well. But you talk about the abundance of proofs in the last slide. You talked about the abundance of proofs of the one identical system. What evidence can you show me about this? And the answer is by way of self-consistency. The secret doctrine, of which my secret doctrine is just a portion relevant to our age, that is the accumulated wisdom of the ages, and it is the uninterrupted record covering thousands of generations of seers who verified and tested the traditions passed on to them orally from one race to another. So this is very much working in the spirit of science. We don't just hypothesize, we put forward a proposition and we test it, except that in your scientific laboratories you have different forms of testing which are perfectly fine. But in our laboratory of consciousness, or so to speak, the laboratory of the eternal wisdom, it is the experience of thousands of generations of seers who have verified the traditions that have been passed on. And I would point out to you that tradition is not the worship of ashes, but as Gustav Mahler said, tradition is the transmission of the flame, the transmission of fire, handing on the flame. But my next question is, you talk about self-consistency. Can you summarize how this self-consistency you talk about plays out in practice? So how do you propose to demonstrate to the educated public what the Mahachohan said about the doctrine we promulgate being the only true one? That's quite a statement to make, being the only true one. So how do you want to demonstrate this? First, let's see what the Mahachohan really meant and how he framed his question. Have a look at the table below. The Mahachohan tells us that the doctrine we promulgate is the only true one. But it must be supported by evidence as we are preparing to give, become ultimately triumphant as every other. But it's very important, therefore, to inculcate it gradually and enforce its theories and unimpeachable facts for those who know, with direct inferences deduced from and corroborated by evidence from modern exact science. So this is rather like putting filters upon truth. And what I mean is, regard the doctrine we promulgate being the only true one, being the bright light that is so bright, the light of divine truth. It's so bright, if we look at it, we couldn't face it. So we have to sort of filter down that light. So there has to be some degree of censorship. Evidence as we're preparing to give. But the rate of revelation is very important. You can't do it all in one go, otherwise it will confuse and disrupt people. So you have to inculcate it gradually. We also have to enforce its theories for those who know. So we have to give it to people who have the capacity to understand. And those people are living in an age of science. So we must also corroborate this with direct inferences from science. So we are putting filters of censorship, revelation, capacity to understand, and degree of scientific advancement on the only one doctrine we promulgate, being the true one. But now, the right-hand side of this diagram shows how the numerous branches in physical science have been brought together in our work, the Secret Doctrine and other works, as the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy that we stated earlier. So the process here is exactly by analogy with white light. So just as white light is decomposed or refracted by a prism into the various colors of the solar spectrum, so the beams of divine truth are refracted through the prism of man's lower intellect, and that breaks it up into the various fragments called the numerous branches in physical science. So by synthesizing all these colored beams of light, we find that their source is the one single beam of divine truth. Here, the process is really talking of faculties of consciousness. On the right-hand side, we're still talking about consciousness, but we're phrasing it in terms of modern science. Here we're talking of intuition, the inner faculty. Here we're talking about the conceptualizing mind that conceives and comprehends. But then, thank you very much, but I don't have time to wade through all this occult stuff. We're just having coffee, so can you please summarize just 2 or 3 key aphorisms or words of wisdom from your writings that are relevant to our 2025 scientific age that can help me, poor me, struggling to find time? Well, I'm not really happy to hear this because If you would stop twitching and chattering on your silly little iPad and throw away your television, you would have time. You trust me. There's always time for genuine inquiry. And I must tell you, and this is not meant to be patronizing, Theosophy can't be spoon-fed with honey, and Theosophy is not for numbskulls. It is only for those who can drive themselves to think. But you kindly brought me a coffee, and it's a good day for me, so I'll try and help you. These are three key issues which plague scientists, psychologists, and people in general, besetting our times, which I am putting in your terms. Is there life elsewhere in the universe? How is consciousness produced by the brain? And even though neuroscience claims to be so far advanced, why can't it explain the wide disparity between the genius and the imbecile? And no, I'm not being rude, but please keep wokery well away from me. I hope you'll do that. So let's just deal with life in the universe. This is an area of frenetic scientific exploration, sending probes to Mars. The recent probe close to the sun, not to find life there, but to find out about the sun. All of this presupposes the NASA definition of life, that life is nothing but a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution and considered only from the point of view of earthly life. So when we talk about life, you scientists only think of it in terms of earthly life, capable of Darwinian evolution. And you sometimes like to quote that the universe, the more it seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless, from Steven Weinberg, one of your Nobel laureates. But I'll tell you something more. There is the spiritual understanding of life. And just because you can't remember and can't perceive any signs of life that you can recognize or perceive consciousness, say in stones or plants, you've got no right to say that consciousness doesn't exist. Everything in the universe, throughout all its kingdoms, is conscious. And it's endowed with a consciousness of its own kind and on its own plane of perception. One of the most fundamental ideas you need to get into your mind is that there is no such thing as dead matter or blind or unconscious law. These have no conception amongst esotericists. And the trouble with you Darwinian scientists and materialistic scientists is that you tend to stop at surface appearances. But for us occultists and esotericists, the universals or the noumenal causative essences have far more reality than their particulars or objective counterparts. Now, when I talk about the universals, in my secret doctrine, I mention that the writing, the exposition, is in the nature of an algebraic formula. Right in the poem, you'll see this. Now, what's so wonderful about algebra is it is algebra a statement of universals within a particular field of application, of course. So with an algebraic formula, when you put in details of the individual parameters, you get an answer which is really dependent on the universal formula to which it is tailored and tagged. So the simplest formula you learnt at school was distance equals speed times time. So whether you are on the moon or on Mars or on Earth, if you multiply the distance by the speed, you will get the time. So in that way, it is a universal algebraic formula. Likewise, the secret doctrine is as an algebraic formula where it pertains to all ages and all times when you adjust the input parameters. Now, your next area of frenetic scientific inquiry is the brain. The vast number of your mainstream scientists will say, how does the brain generate or produce consciousness? And I tell you, it doesn't. We think through the brain, not with the brain. So if we trace then all our personal thoughts and feelings to brain work, it is only because in that mansion called the human body, the brain is the front door and the only one which opens out into space. That's the front door. All the others are inner doors, opening in the private building through which travel incessantly the transmitting agents of memory and sensation. These are the inner doors. And the intensity of these depend on the state of health and the organic soundness of the transmitters. You neuroscientists must understand that the brain is only the front door, the one which opens out into space. The heart is the seat of consciousness. There is also the generative system in addition to the brain. So the brain is what unites life and form, spirit and matter. Finally, your third question is, neuroscience is so far advanced, but why can't it explain the disparity between the genius and the imbecile? To answer your question, I draw the analogy between the physical man, the musical instrument, and the higher self, the performing artist. The higher self, the Paganini in this example, could not play music unless he had an instrument to perform on. That's pretty obvious. Now, the instrument can be either a Stradivarius or a cheap fiddle. So the higher self needs a brain and body. But whether we provide the higher self, our parent self, we provide it with a refined or a coarse musical instrument, it is our job to make sure that the higher self, our Paganini, is provided with the most refined and beautiful musical instrument. But whether the higher self gets a cheap or cracked fiddle or a Stradivarius is entirely the result of karma. So it is our karma and it is our doing in many lives and over many lives to ensure that the higher self will have an ever more beautiful and refined instrument to express its full potential ever more beautifully. Because, as Mabel Collins has said, who shared a house with me, with Blavatsky in London, the soul of man is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor has no limits. But the growth and splendor depends on us refining the brain and body such that we provide the higher self with a Stradivarius and not a cheap or cracked fiddle. Now, moving on, I have this inquiry for you. Many people in the Theosophical Society, some of them your lifelong students, regard your teachings as the last word, as the sort of gold standard by which all other teachings must be judged. So, do you consider yourself as having provided the last word on theosophy? Ever since I joined the Theosophical Society, I've heard people taking sides. Oh, you must read only Blavatsky, or you must read only Besant. But most people said you, Blavatsky, provided the last word. So what is your answer to this? Do you consider yourself as having provided the last word on theosophy? And I say this, to regard me as the ultimate peerless authority is one of the most utterly pernicious ideas amongst Theosophists, many of whom consider themselves to be deep students, but not deep enough to have understood the import of the second object of the society, or even bothered to read the General Council rules on freedom of thought and freedom of the society. Here are some of my equals and my peers within and outside the formal Theosophical Society, just a few of them. Subbarao, who died at such an early age, whom I um, asked, invited to write the Secret Doctrine with me, if that story be true. But he declined because he thought the world was not prepared for this just at the moment. Franz Hartmann, whose wonderful works we saw at the displayed so beautifully at the European School in Ascona. Paul Brunton, whom I personally regard as an absolute equal to Blavatsky, but his teachings are on a different line. They're not so much on the occult side, but they take a different line. But I regard Brunton as the absolute equal of Blavatsky. And when we talk of equals, we're not putting them on weighing scales and weighing their equality. To say one is superior to the other is about as idiotic as saying Mozart is superior to Bach. At that level, comparisons are utterly meaningless. Then that wonderful occultist and chemist, Dr. Timely, Rudolf Steiner, who took a different but parallel line, Manly Palmer Hall, and then the great Annie Besant. So these are my peers. But I see you mention Annie Besant. So why, in a society based on universal brotherhood, have I personally witnessed such animosity amongst members, the so-called deep students, against Annie Besant, and why acrimony towards those members in favor of her? Well, the best answer I can give you is that small mentalities will never appreciate a large truth. And small minds who only operate in black and white dichotomies, I'm being polite, I'm not calling them fundamentalists. But here are some of my letters, my personal letters too, and in reference to Annie Besant. I would be happy to stand on my knees before her in the astral light. And I believe in but one person in England, that is you. And I am your true friend till the blessed day of my deliverance. And in my letter to Judge, I refer to Annie Besant as the soul of honour, uncompromisingly truthful. And her heart is like one single unbroken diamond. And we can see it is filled with pure, unadulterated theosophy and enthusiasm, unselfishness, and altruism is Annie Besant's name. So these are all my letters to and regarding Annie Besant. So how dare later generations of Theosophists stand on their stilts and soapboxes and pontificate about whose teaching is the one and only gold standard, and how dare they throw divisions between all of us Theosophists who are trying to bring the universal teachings to the public, but we can only express these teachings in different ways. I hear the complaint that my teachings in the sacred doctrine are far too complicated and they need to be simplified. Well, Annie Besant did much of that work and provided much of that simplification. And then she gets charged with having corrupted my teachings. This is nonsense. She just put my teachings in a different mode. She expressed them differently. She looked at them from a different angle and a different perspective. I believe in but one person in England, and this is you, Annie Besant. One last question. I believe you also had contact with Freemasonry. Are you a Freemason? And how does that, if so, how does it square with Theosophy? Well, the answer is yes, I am. Because 1 month after the publication of ISIS, I wrote to a Russian colleague about having received a degree of Arch Auditor from one of the principal Masonic lodges in India. And in my writings, there are many allusions to Masonry. For example, King Solomon, Hiram Abif, and I refer to the Triple Tower of Royal Arch Masonry in collected writings. And the complementarity of Theosophy and Freemasonry, excuse the spelling mistake, concerns their respective focuses. Whereas Theosophy focuses primarily on the content, Masonry focuses on the form of that content, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. But I can't go into this now, but there is an excellent Blavatsky lecture by Professor John Algeo, a peerless theosophist, vice president of the Theosophical Society, and he goes into the Western mystery tradition, Freemasonry, and Blavatsky's total and whole involvement with that. But I'm beginning to see you're looking a bit wary with all this heavyweight stuff. And yes, the Inquirer says I'm developing a headache, so can we please change the subject? Well, all right. Let's close with music. and I will show you my musical contemporaries, and then I'll tell you about my own piano teacher. And incidentally, I'm a member of the Philharmonic Society in London, as Mr. Sinnott has noted quite accurately in his book on some incidents in my life. Now, here are all the great composers who were my contemporaries. So I am a contemporary of Paganini, Rossini, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schumann, Moscheles, Clara Schumann, Liszt, Wagner, Brahms, Verdi, Puccini, Tchaikovsky, and Rachmaninoff, Grieg, and Debussy. How many people can claim to have such a galaxy of composers as contemporaries? And Beethoven and Schubert only missed me by a few years. All the stories you read about my having had lessons with Moscheles would appear to be true. Some say that I played duets with Clara Schumann. Maybe you'd like to verify that for yourself. I think it is true, but you may like to verify that for yourself. But here is my teacher, Ignaz Moscheles, and here is Clara Schumann, and here is Moscheles' piano. And if you read the Mahatma letters carefully, you will see KH saying that music is the most divine and spiritual of arts. And when occupied by the Mahatmas, her playing, that's Blavatsky's playing, was indescribably grand. In my performing career, I played the piano under the name of Madame Laura. And there is a famous passage in William Kingsland's book on me where Kingsland describes how I visited his home in London and sat down at the piano and played the Liszt transcription of Schubert's Erlking, which is one of the most fearsomely difficult pieces, difficult enough in Schubert's original as the accompaniment to the song, but in the Liszt transcription, it's twice as difficult. And Kingsland never knew that I was a pianist, and he was delighted that I played for him. So, in conclusion, now, the cards of destiny have dealt humankind a jewel beyond price in H.P. Blavatsky's message of spiritual uplift and universal brotherhood, to be obtained by knowledge of the eternal verities of our existence. Have we used this sublime gift with gratitude, understanding, and love? Well, who is to say? All spiritual teachers are but messengers. They proffer no initiations and perform no miracles at our behest. So all we can do is to honor this great lady who openly stated that the doctrine she put out was not hers, but his that sent me. And she can offer no further counsel than to say that she can show us how to find those who will show us the secret gateway. And for those who win onward, there is reward, of course, past all telling. And if we fail in this life, well, thank goodness, there are other lives in which success may yet come.